What if the most powerful woman in America found her truest connection not in politics, but in secret letters that could have ended her career? Buried deep in the archives of history lies a love story too bold for its time, a First Lady's private words, and the woman who held her heart. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever discovered a story that made you completely rethink a person you thought you knew? If this one surprises you, make sure to hit the like button, share it so others can see it too, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and your perspective might just spark our next deep dive. New York City 1928. The rain fell in thin silver needles, turning the streets into mirrors of gaslight and shadow. Lorena Hickok, known to friends and colleagues simply as Hick, tightened her coat against the damp wind as she stepped onto the sidewalk outside the Women's City Club. Inside, she had just completed a press interview with a tall, poised woman whose presence seemed to bend the air in the room. That woman was Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of New York's newly elected governor, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Hick had interviewed many political spouses in her career as a top Associated Press reporter, but none had left her with this odd sense of lingering warmth, as if she had brushed against something rare. Eleanor was unlike the tightly polished socialites Hick was used to. Her handshake was firm, her gray-blue eyes curious and unhurried. She spoke about education reform and women's civic engagement, not with rehearsed lines, but with a quiet conviction that felt lived in. Hick, who had built her career on cutting through public facades, found herself intrigued. Eleanor was born into privilege, a Roosevelt by marriage and a Roosevelt by birth. Her uncle was Theodore Roosevelt. Yet she carried a reserve that hinted at an inner distance from the glittering circles she inhabited. Hick, on the other hand, had clawed her way up from poverty. She grew up in rural Wisconsin, enduring a childhood marked by abuse and instability. At 15, she left home to work as a maid, later training herself in journalism through sheer will and talent. By the time she met Eleanor, Hick was one of the most respected female political reporters in America, sharp-witted, direct, and immune to intimidation. On paper, they should have remained polite acquaintances. But history often pivots on moments when opposites meet and recognize in the other an unspoken kinship. Their paths crossed again in the months that followed, as Hick covered Eleanor's work in New York. The more interviews they shared, the less they resembled journalist and subject. Conversations wandered from politics to books, from current events to childhood memories. Hick discovered that beneath Eleanor's dignified exterior lay a deep yearning for authentic connection, the kind rarely afforded to women in public life. In late 1932, as Franklin campaigned for the presidency, Eleanor and Hick began exchanging letters. They were practical at first, scheduling interviews, sharing political observations, but soon shifted into something more personal. Hick's letters were candid, laced with humor and occasional bursts of tenderness. Eleanor's replies grew warmer, sometimes hesitant, as if she were surprised by her own openness. When Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in November 1932, Eleanor's world transformed overnight. As First Lady, she was thrust into a relentless schedule of public appearances, press conferences, and political negotiations. Yet, amid the demands of the role, she carved out time for Hick, inviting her on train rides, slipping her into small dinners, and sending letters almost daily. For Hick, who had built her career on objectivity, this closeness posed a problem. The Associated Press insisted on impartiality, but she was no longer merely covering a political figure. She was entwined in her life. Within months of Franklin's inauguration, Hick made the startling decision to leave her job. Officially, it was to join the Federal Emergency Relief Administration as an investigator of Depression-era poverty. Unofficially, it freed her from the constraints that had kept her from being openly at Eleanor's side. The correspondence between them deepened into something extraordinary. Hick wrote with a raw honesty rare for the time, Describing her feelings without fear of judgment, "I ache to hold you close," she confided in one letter. Eleanor's replies, though often more restrained, carried an unmistakable intimacy. "I miss you greatly, and I'm so glad you're in the world." In an era when such words between two women were often cloaked in euphemism, theirs were remarkably unguarded. The letters became a lifeline, a private space where Eleanor could shed the armor of First Lady and simply be a woman speaking to someone who understood her. Their relationship unfolded in fragments between public duties and private rendezvous. Hick often accompanied Eleanor on inspection trips for relief programs, traveling by car through dusty Midwestern towns or boarding trains bound for the Deep South. They would share cramped hotel rooms under the guise of economy, talking late into the night about politics, personal dreams, and the loneliness of public life. In Washington, Hick sometimes stayed at the White House in a bedroom just down the hall from Eleanor's. On quiet evenings, Eleanor would slip away from receptions and formal dinners to join her for tea. The two of them sitting cross-legged on the bed, the clamor of the political world muffled behind closed doors. Yet their closeness did not exist in a vacuum. The 1930s were not kind to women whose affections defied convention. Both knew that any hint of impropriety could be weaponized against Franklin's administration and Eleanor's work. Hick, fiercely protective, often urged caution, while Eleanor balanced her longing for companionship with her deep sense of duty. There was also the matter of Franklin himself. Though their marriage was no longer a traditional romantic partnership, complicated by his earlier affair with Lucy Mercer, Eleanor remained committed to the political and familial alliance they shared. Hick's presence was accepted to a point, but it existed in the shadows. By the mid-1930s, Eleanor's public role had expanded beyond anything expected of a First Lady. She was traveling more, speaking out on civil rights, labor reform, and women's political participation. Hick, now working for the Democratic National Committee, often coordinated her appearances, a role that kept them connected but also introduced new tensions. Hick sometimes struggled with Eleanor's divided attention, resenting the demands of the public that pulled her away. Eleanor, in turn, worried that Hick's possessiveness might create friction in an already delicate balance. Their bond remained strong, but under the surface, questions began to form. Could they preserve the intimacy they had built in those first years? Or would the very forces that had brought them together, politics, ambition, the tides of history, inevitably pull them apart? Washington, D.C., winter 1935. Snow fell quietly over the Capitol, softening the outlines of its monuments. Inside the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt sat at her desk in a dimly lit sitting room, her fountain pen scratching steadily over creamy stationery. Her letters were deliberate, shaped by a mind that weighed each phrase, and yet, when writing to Hick, the formality slipped. The words bent toward the personal, the tender. "It is such a comfort to know you are there. I think of you so often, and I wish you were beside me." The White House staff knew Hick by sight now. She came and went without the awkward introductions reserved for strangers. Sometimes she stayed in the Lincoln bedroom, sometimes in a guest room closer to Eleanor's quarters. The press corps, always alert for signs of intrigue, chose to frame her as a close friend of the First Lady, a phrase vague enough to shield what no one dared to say outright. Their lives fell into a rhythm dictated by travel and obligation. When Eleanor toured the country advocating for New Deal programs, Hick would often meet her along the route in a Kansas train depot, a Chicago hotel lobby, or a modest boarding house in rural Georgia. These meetings, however brief, were the lifeblood of their connection. Between visits, the letters flew back and forth. Hick's were vivid and unfiltered. She described the loneliness of hotel rooms, the ache of waiting for the next time they would meet. Eleanor's were a study in subtlety, careful not to be incriminating if intercepted, but laced with warmth. "I think of you with longing and happiness, and I'm counting the days." The United States Postal Service became their silent accomplice, carrying a record of one of the most intimate correspondences in American political history. By 1935, Eleanor's influence had expanded beyond her ceremonial duties. She wrote a syndicated newspaper column, My Day, speaking directly to millions of readers about issues from poverty relief to women's employment. She held press conferences exclusively for female reporters, forcing newspapers to hire women in order to cover the First Lady's words. She visited coal mines, migrant labor camps, and segregated schools, often without fanfare, but always with purpose. Hick, now working for the Democratic National Committee, sometimes arranged these appearances, coordinating with local organizers. She admired Eleanor's courage, but also felt the sting of distance as her public commitments multiplied. The woman who had once written daily was now often too exhausted at night to put pen to paper. In one letter, Hick confessed her frustration. "I know the country needs you, but selfishly, I want more of you for myself." Eleanor replied with a mix of affection and apology. "I wish it were possible, dear one, to be two people at once." The secrecy surrounding their bond was both a shield and a burden. In 1930s America, same-sex relationships between women were rarely acknowledged openly, but they were not entirely invisible. The risk for Eleanor was not merely scandal. It was political ruin for her husband's presidency and the causes she championed. Franklin Roosevelt was aware of Hick's closeness to his wife, though how much he understood or cared remains debated by historians. His own extramarital relationships made it difficult for him to take a moral high ground. Still, appearances mattered, and Eleanor was careful to avoid giving the press an image they could twist into scandal. For Hick, the secrecy was harder to bear. She was not bound by a public office, and she resented the compromises required to keep their relationship in the shadows. On more than one occasion, she considered ending it entirely, only to find herself drawn back by the pull of Eleanor's letters, by the memory of her voice in the quiet hours before dawn. As the decade wore on, the world outside the White House grew darker. The Great Depression lingered stubbornly, and in Europe, authoritarian regimes rose like storm clouds. Eleanor threw herself even more deeply into political work, advocating for refugees, denouncing racial discrimination, supporting labor rights. Hick admired her public courage, but saw the toll it took in private. In letters, she encouraged Eleanor to rest, to take time for herself, but the First Lady seemed almost incapable of slowing down. The rare weekends they spent together at Valkill, Eleanor's stone cottage in Hyde Park, became sacred. There, away from Washington, they could walk along the Hudson River, sit by the fire with books, or share unhurried meals. Hick described these days as the only times the noise stops. No love exists without moments of doubt, and theirs was no exception. Eleanor's circle of friends was wide, including politicians, reformers, and intellectuals who admired her work. Hick, protective to the point of possessiveness, sometimes bristled at these connections, especially when Eleanor grew close to other women. One such figure was Marian Dickerman, a longtime friend and co-owner of Valkill. Though Eleanor insisted the relationships were different, Hick could not shake the fear of being replaced. In one particularly raw letter, she wrote, "I am not sure where I belong in your life anymore." Eleanor responded with characteristic gentleness, assuring Hick of her enduring affection, but reminding her that her life was a tapestry woven of many threads. "You are a part of me, Hick," she wrote. No one could take that away. The very traits that had first drawn them together, Eleanor's drive, her sense of purpose, her commitment to public service, also kept them apart. Hick, who had once been a celebrated reporter, found her own professional identity dimming in comparison to Eleanor's luminous public presence. She began to feel like a satellite orbiting a planet that could never slow its spin. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt won re-election in a landslide. solidifying Eleanor's place as one of the most influential First Ladies in history. But the victory meant another 4 years of intense public life, and for Hick, another 4 years of waiting for moments stolen from the edges of that life. By the late 1930s, Hick made a painful decision. She would step back from the intensity of their closeness, not out of diminished love, but from a recognition that the balance between them had shifted irreversibly. She took a job outside Washington, reducing the frequency of their meetings but continuing to write. The letters changed in tone, still affectionate, but less urgent, more reflective. They began to speak of shared memories rather than immediate longing. Hick's voice in the correspondence remained steadfast, but she no longer demanded as much of Eleanor's time. Even as the nature of their relationship evolved, the emotional core remained. When World War II erupted, Eleanor's duties expanded yet again, visiting troops, championing human rights, serving as a delegate to the United Nations after Franklin's death. Hick was no longer at her side in the same way, but the letters continued for decades. In the end, their love was not defined by physical proximity, but by the depth of their connection. They had built, in the margins of history, a partnership sustained by trust, understanding, and a shared vision of the world as it could be. Yet, even as they found new rhythms, the question lingered in the silence between words. Could a love lived in fragments ever be whole? Or was it enough that it existed at all? A quiet thread woven through the great tapestry of history? Hyde Park, New York 1945. The October air was sharp with the scent of falling leaves. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was gone. His death in April had brought an end to an era. Eleanor, now a widow, stood on the porch of Valkill, looking out toward the slow-moving Hudson River. She was no longer First Lady, but she was far from retiring into obscurity. Invitations poured in from around the world, to speak, to write, to serve on commissions. The United Nations loomed large in her future. Hick, no longer working in Washington, had moved into a quieter life of journalism and occasional government work. Their relationship had weathered the long middle years, a steady thread through decades of political upheaval and personal evolution, but now it entered a new phase. Without the constraints of the White House, one might have expected more freedom for them to be together. Yet Eleanor's new commitments paradoxically scattered her even farther across the globe. By now, the letters between Eleanor and Hick numbered in the thousands. They were not simply love letters. They were chronicles of an era layered with political observation, personal reflection, and intimate affection. Some were brief, notes dashed off before boarding a train. Others stretched into several pages, recounting in detail the weather, the mood of a meeting, or a memory that had surfaced unbidden. Hick preserved many of these letters, though not without hesitation. She was acutely aware that their contents, if read without context, could invite speculation, even scandal. Yet she could not bring herself to destroy them. They were, after all, the record of her truest bond. During World War II, Eleanor had traveled extensively to visit U.S. troops and inspect Red Cross facilities. She journeyed to the Pacific, to Britain under the Blitz, to the Mediterranean. Hick followed these travels through dispatches in the newspapers and through Eleanor's occasional letters from overseas. The letters often read like they were written in stolen minutes, hurried, warm, and tinged with longing. In one wartime note, Eleanor wrote, "I think of you when I see the soldiers laughing over a letter from home. There is such comfort in knowing someone waits for you." Hick responded with a simple line that spoke volumes. "I have been waiting for you all my life." In 1946, President Truman appointed Eleanor as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. It was a role she embraced with unrelenting energy, particularly in drafting and advocating for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These years made her a global figure in her own right, but they also meant long stretches away from the familiar hearth of Valkill and from Hick. Still, they carved out moments when they could. Sometimes Hick would come to Valkill while Eleanor was away, tending to the house and gardens, leaving small notes for her to find upon returning. In those quiet gestures, there was a continuity to their love, proof that even when time and geography kept them apart, they inhabited the same emotional space. Historians and biographers have long debated the exact nature of their relationship. Some frame it as an intense friendship of the kind more common among women in the early 20th century, when emotional intimacy between female friends carried fewer social restrictions. Others see it as a romantic relationship constrained by the political and cultural realities of their time. But to reduce it to a simple label misses the point. What is clear from Eleanor's pet names, from Hick's possessiveness, from their shared silences and playful teases, is that theirs was a connection that defied tidy categorization. It was part friendship, part romance, part intellectual companionship. Above all, it was sustaining. By the 1950s, Hick's health began to decline. She suffered from diabetes and other ailments that limited her mobility. Eleanor, still active on the world stage, visited when she could. But the imbalance in their lives, one forever in motion, the other increasingly bound to home, grew sharper. Yet even in this period, their correspondence remained a lifeline. Hick continued to tease Eleanor about her relentless schedule, urging her to slow down, to remember the joy of idle afternoons by the river. Eleanor, in turn, reassured Hick that she carried her in mind through every diplomatic dinner and every committee meeting. Eleanor Roosevelt died on November 7, 1962. The news swept the world. Tributes poured in from heads of state, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens whose lives she had touched. For Hick, the loss was more private, more cutting. She had not merely lost a public figure. She had lost the one constant presence in her life for over 3 decades. In the months after Eleanor's death, Hick faced a dilemma. She held hundreds of letters, a treasure of historical and personal significance. Some urged her to destroy them to protect Eleanor's reputation. Others believed they should be preserved as a record of her humanity. Hick ultimately chose to deposit them in the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, under the condition that they remained sealed for a decade. When the letters were finally made available to researchers in the 1970s, they sparked a re-examination of Eleanor Roosevelt's personal life. The tenderness and intimacy in the correspondence surprised many, and for some, it challenged long-held perceptions of her. For others, it only deepened admiration. Here was a woman whose public courage was matched by private vulnerability. Hick did not live to see the public debates these letters would ignite. She died in 1968, but in leaving the letters intact, she ensured that the record of their connection would not vanish into rumor or forgetfulness. Today, the story of Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok is told in biographies, plays, and scholarly studies. It is neither a conventional romance nor a simple friendship, but something more complex, a love that thrived in the margins of history, constrained by circumstance yet resilient enough to endure for decades. Their bond offers a lesson in the many forms love can take, especially when lived under the watchful eye of the public. It speaks to the possibility of deep connection without the structures or certainties that most love stories rely upon. Love, as their story shows, does not always fit neatly into the shapes society expects. It can be a partnership sustained across years of absence, a devotion carried in letters rather than in daily life. It can exist in the spaces between public duty and private longing, surviving not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. In the end, their love was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its daily affirmations, in its quarrels and reconciliations. Extraordinary in its endurance against the tides of history. As long as their words survive, so does the truth of what they shared. Not a scandal, not a footnote, but a testament to the quiet power of human attachment. Paris, 1780. The marble halls of Versailles glittered with candlelight. Every surface seemed to hum with opulence. Gilded moldings, polished mirrors, and silks that whispered against parquet floors. For Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the young and precociously gifted portraitist, this was both her studio and her stage. She was only in her 20s, yet she had already been named the official portrait painter to Queen Marie Antoinette. Her skill was undeniable. Her brush captured not just likeness, but vitality. Nobles competed to have their faces immortalized on her canvases, their jewels rendered with a precision that made them gleam even in the dimmest light. Yet behind the poise she maintained before patrons, Elizabeth felt the constant strain of court life, the rigid hierarchies, the whispered intrigues, the ever-present gaze of those who measured every gesture for advantage. It was during one of her sittings with the Queen that Elizabeth first saw Count Hans Axel von Fersen, the Swedish nobleman whose presence in France caused more than a few raised eyebrows. Tall, graceful, with an easy manner that seemed at odds with the stiff etiquette of Versailles, Fersen was already rumored to be more than a friend to the Queen. His eyes, a piercing blue, carried a steadiness that unsettled and intrigued her. In their first conversation, he showed none of the arrogance common among courtiers. Instead, he asked about her work, how she chose her colors, how she persuaded subjects to relax before her. Elizabeth, accustomed to being treated as a service provider rather than an equal, felt a spark of something rare, genuine curiosity. They began to meet in the spaces between official duties, in the Queen's salons, at masked balls, and the bustling corridors behind the public chambers. Sometimes their exchanges were little more than polite observations about a concert or a diplomatic visitor. But beneath the surface, something unspoken took root. Fersen's own position was a tightrope. Though loyal to the Queen, he traveled often between France and Sweden, serving both his monarch and France's political interests. His visits to Versailles were never long, yet each one seemed to realign Elizabeth's sense of the court. She found herself painting with a sharper focus, as though his occasional, appreciative glance at her work validated it in a way no royal commission could. At first, there were no letters. It was too dangerous. In the court's environment of constant surveillance, a misplaced note could ignite scandal. Instead, their communication was built on small moments: a nod across the Queen's music room, a half smile at a crowded supper, a deliberate pause by the easel as she painted. These were fleeting, fragile gestures, yet each one lingered in Elizabeth's mind long after he had gone. She began to notice that her portraits of the Queen subtly changed. In them, Marie Antoinette's gaze softened, her posture eased, perhaps a reflection of Elizabeth's own shifting awareness of intimacy, even if it was not her own with the Queen, but an empathy with the magnetic pull she sensed between Marie and Fersen. The court was a golden prison. Elizabeth knew that her role, though prestigious, was precarious. A misinterpreted smile, an alliance with the wrong patron, or even a change in political wind could banish her from Versailles overnight. To nurture any personal attachment, let alone one to a man so close to the Queen, was to invite danger. And yet, the pull was there. Fersen had a way of making the grandeur of Versailles fade, if only for moments. In their rare private conversations, perhaps while standing too long before one of her finished canvases after others had left, he spoke not of politics or gossip, but of the feeling of open seas during his travels, of the forests in Sweden in winter, of a life where people were known for their character rather than their titles. Marie Antoinette was not oblivious. Elizabeth, as both painter and friend to the Queen, occupied a unique position. She knew of the whispers that followed Fersen, but in the Queen's presence, the Swedish Count's manner remained carefully respectful. Still, Elizabeth sometimes caught the Queen watching them with an inscrutable expression, not jealousy, but perhaps a quiet curiosity. In time, Elizabeth realized that whatever her feelings for Farzan might have been, they were tangled in a web of loyalty to the Queen. This awareness added a bittersweet edge to their encounters. To act upon any spark between them would not only endanger her position, but also risk hurting the one patron who had elevated her beyond anything she might have achieved otherwise. There were a few occasions, however, when circumstance contrived to grant them more than a passing word. Once, at a small gathering in a private salon away from the rigid formality of the main palace, they found themselves seated beside each other. Conversation drifted from music to painting to the nature of beauty itself. Farzan remarked, with a hint of playfulness, that Elizabeth's portraits revealed truths about their subjects they might prefer to hide. "And what," she countered, "would your portrait reveal?" He considered this with a slight smile. "Perhaps," he said, "that I am not nearly as free as I appear." The words stayed with her long after the evening ended. When Farzan left Versailles that winter, Elizabeth did not know when she would see him again. She returned to her easels, to the endless demands of the court, to the delicate dance of favor and politics. Yet there was a new restlessness in her work, as though each brushstroke was a search for something she could not name. The revolution was still years away, but the first rumblings were already felt in the murmurs of the city beyond the gilded gates. Elizabeth could not yet imagine how drastically the world and her life would change. All she knew was that a thread had been tied between herself and the Swedish count, one that might stretch across continents and years, but which neither of them seemed willing to cut. Cliffhanger. Would this connection survive the turbulence to come, or would it dissolve like so many secrets of Versailles, whispered once, and then forever lost to the shadows of history? The summer heat of 1789, Paris had grown restless. Elizabeth felt it even within the thick walls of her atelier. The streets beyond were no longer filled only with the chatter of market women and the clatter of carriages. Now there were shouts, pamphlets, and angry gatherings. The king's authority, once a given, was being questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable when she first entered the Queen's service. For Elizabeth, the court was no longer just a place of ceremony and art. It had become a fortress under siege. Those who once clamored for portraits now looked uneasy at the idea of being associated with the royal family. She, the Queen's favored painter, found herself caught in the tightening vice of public opinion. It was in this climate that Hans Axel von Fersen returned to Versailles. His presence brought both relief and danger. Relief because he still carried the same quiet steadiness she remembered. Danger because his closeness to the Queen made him a lightning rod for suspicion. They met again at a small, heavily guarded gathering in the Petit Trianon. The Queen was pale, her usual lightness dimmed, but her eyes brightened at the sight of Farzan. Elizabeth stood in her familiar role, sketchbook in hand, but she was no longer just an observer of beauty. She was watching something else, a man who risked his safety to return, and a queen who seemed to draw breath more fully in his presence. Farzan and Elizabeth spoke only briefly that evening, in the shadowed edge of the salon as music drifted from another room. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low voice. "Perhaps not," he replied, "but I cannot stay away when friends are in danger." He used the word friends, and yet his eyes carried more meaning, or perhaps she simply wanted to believe they did. Still, she sensed that whatever bound him to France was more than duty. Her work began to change again. She painted faster now, aware that each portrait might be the last of its kind before the revolution consumed the world she knew. In the Queen's latest commission, Elizabeth captured not just regal poise, but a quiet defiance, a woman aware that her power was fading, yet refusing to bow to fear. Farzan praised the painting when he saw it. "You have given her strength," he told Elizabeth. "She already has it," she replied. "I only showed the truth." In those moments, she wondered if he understood how much her art was influenced by his presence, how the courage she painted in others was something she too needed. By late summer, rumors swirled around the court. Some claimed the queen planned to flee. Others whispered that Fersen was the architect of her escape. Elizabeth knew better than to ask directly, but she saw the signs: hushed conversations in corridors, sudden absences, coded notes delivered under the guise of portrait appointments. Their own exchanges grew rarer and riskier. Once, in the cramped servants' passage behind her studio, they crossed paths by chance. He paused just long enough to say, "If things turn, leave Paris at once." She wanted to ask where she should go, if she might see him again, but footsteps approached and the moment was gone. In October, when the market women of Paris marched on Versailles, Elizabeth witnessed the palace's transformation from a symbol of grandeur to a beleaguered stronghold. She stayed within her rooms, brush in hand, but unable to focus, listening to the distant roar of the crowd. She thought of Fersen. Was he inside the palace now, standing guard in his own way? Or already gone, carrying messages that might determine the queen's fate? When the royal family was forced to move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, Elizabeth followed them for as long as she could. The city was different now, tense, watchful, and unpredictable. Every day felt like a test of loyalty and survival. It was in early 1791 that she learned, through whispers in the queen's household, of Fersen's most dangerous act yet, helping to orchestrate the royal family's attempted escape. Disguised as a coachman, he had driven part of the route himself. The plan nearly succeeded before ending in capture at Varennes. When Elizabeth heard the news, her heart sank, not only for the king and queen, but for Fersen, who now carried the mark of failure in the eyes of both allies and enemies. She did not see him for months after that, though she heard he had fled France for his own safety. Her own exile began soon after. With the revolution turning ever more violent, Elizabeth left Paris under the pretense of fulfilling commissions abroad. She painted in Italy, Austria, and Russia, but France and Fersen were never far from her thoughts. In foreign salons, she sometimes heard his name mentioned, usually with a mix of admiration and suspicion. She wondered if he thought of her at all, or if their connection had been nothing more than fleeting glances and half-spoken truce in the candlelit corridors of Versailles. In 1793, word reached her through discreet channels. A letter, unsigned but unmistakably his, had been sent to a mutual acquaintance. It spoke of loyalty, of unfinished conversations, of the queen's execution, a tragedy that had marked them both. Though it contained no declarations of love, Elizabeth read between the lines and found the same steady voice that had once made her believe that beauty and truth could survive even in the darkest times. Cliffhanger. Would they meet again now that the world they knew had been torn apart? Or would the revolution's exiles remain scattered, each holding only the fragments of connections that once shaped their lives? By 1794, the France Elizabeth had known was gone. The revolution had not only stripped the monarchy of its crown, but scattered its court across Europe like seeds in the wind. The queen, Marie Antoinette, was dead. So was the king. Many of Elizabeth's patrons had met the same fate, their portraits now strange relics of a vanished order. For months, she lived in a kind of suspended grief. She painted to survive, nobles in exile, wealthy merchants, even the occasional foreign dignitary, but every face she captured reminded her of the one she could never paint again. She thought often of Fersen, wondering whether he too carried ghosts. In 1796, fate answered her unspoken question. She was in Vienna, having been invited to paint members of the Austrian court. It was at a quiet supper hosted by a mutual friend that she saw him again. Fersen had aged, though not unhandsomely. His once unshakable poise now held the faintest shadow of weariness. Yet, when he saw her, something in his expression softened, the look of someone recognizing a survivor of the same shipwreck. "I did not know you were in Vienna," he said after the formal greetings. "I might say the same of you," she replied. But perhaps we both have our reasons for not announcing ourselves. Over the next weeks, they met discreetly, at walks in the gardens, in the quieter corners of salons. Their conversations were less about politics now, more about what had been lost and what could still be preserved. They spoke of art, of loyalty, of the Queen, whose memory hung between them like a presence neither could banish. One afternoon, as they strolled along the shaded path of the Augarten, she asked, "Did you love her?" The question slipped out before she could weigh the wisdom of it. He stopped walking. "Love is too small a word for what bound us," he said at last. "It was duty, devotion, and something more, but it is not for the world to define." Elizabeth nodded. She understood, not because she had shared the same bond with Marie Antoinette, but because she knew what it meant to carry an affection that could not be spoken, only lived. And though he did not say it, she wondered if he knew she too had felt her own quiet attachment, perhaps to him, perhaps to the man he had been before the Revolution, when the future had seemed more certain. Fersen asked her to paint his portrait. The sessions were long, as she tried to capture not only his likeness, but the history written in the set of his mouth, the faint lines at his eyes. She worked slowly, savoring the hours, knowing that when the canvas was finished, so too would be the excuse to sit together without suspicion. During one sitting, he asked, "Do you ever think of returning to France?" "Every day," she answered. "But I do not know if it is France that I miss, or simply the France that no longer exists." He said nothing, but his eyes told her he understood exactly what she meant. Their time in Vienna was brief. Fersen was called back to Sweden, and she had commissions waiting in St. Petersburg. On their last evening, they met privately, away from the watchful eyes of court society. "I cannot say when or if we will meet again," he told her. "Then we will let this be enough," she replied. "This moment?" He kissed her hand, a gesture almost antique in its formality, and held it a moment longer than etiquette required. She watched him leave, feeling as though an entire chapter of her life had closed. Years later, in 1810, she learned of his violent death in Stockholm, beaten to death by a mob that believed he had plotted against the crown prince. She was painting in Paris when the news reached her. She set down her brush and did not pick it up for days. She thought of his composure, his quiet courage, his loyalty, qualities that had made him a target in the brutal politics of their age. She wondered if he had known, in their brief years of acquaintance, how much she had admired him. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps some affections were meant to exist only in silence. Elizabeth lived many more years, painting until her hand could no longer hold a brush. She never publicly spoke of Fersen, but in the careful shadows and glints of certain portraits, there were whispers of him, the set of a jaw, the glimmer in an eye, the faint suggestion of melancholy in an otherwise serene expression. When asked in her later years about her greatest works, she named the portraits of queens and aristocrats that had made her famous. But privately, she knew her greatest achievement was having captured, however imperfectly, the trace of a man whose life had intersected hers in the most turbulent of times, a man whose presence had once made the chaos of the world feel, for a moment, bearable. In the end, their connection was neither a romance nor a mere friendship, but something rarer, a shared witness to a lost world, preserved in memory and in art. It was proof that love need not always be declared to be real, and that some bonds survive not because they are shouted, but because they are kept like a secret flame against the cold. The year was 1853, and Clara Schumann, already a celebrated pianist across Europe, was navigating life in the shadow of personal and artistic loss. She was 34 years old, mother to 7 children, and the wife of Robert Schumann, one of the Romantic era's most brilliant composers. Yet Robert's mental health was failing rapidly. His spells of melancholy had deepened into bouts of paranoia and hallucinations. Clara, accustomed to performing to packed concert halls, now found herself balancing public triumph with private despair. It was in this fragile moment that a young man entered her life, a man whose genius was as raw and dazzling as his ambition. Johannes Brahms was just 20 years old when he arrived at the Schumann household in Dusseldorf, carrying under his arm a portfolio of manuscripts and a recommendation from violinist Joseph Joachim. He was, by all accounts, unknown. But from the first moment he sat at the piano, his playing revealed something undeniable, a kind of burning sincerity that leapt from his fingertips. Clara later wrote in her diary that the young man played us sonatas and scherzos of such beauty, so full of mastery, that we were speechless. Robert, impressed beyond measure, would soon hail Brahms as the savior of German music in a famous article titled Neue Bahnen, New Paths. But Clara's first impressions went beyond admiration for his talent. She noticed the shyness behind his confident performance, the almost boyish awkwardness when he rose from the bench. For Brahms, the impact was equally immediate. Clara was not only a renowned artist, but a figure of grace and strength, qualities he had rarely encountered so vividly combined. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made him instinctively protective, though she was more than capable of defending herself. She was a living embodiment of the music he loved, disciplined yet passionate, formal yet deeply human. Over the next months, Brahms became a constant presence in the Schumann home. He played duets with Clara, accompanied her in rehearsals, and discussed compositions with Robert late into the night. The house, once filled with the sound of Robert's latest work, now vibrated with a different kind of energy, the blending of Clara's elegance and Brahms' youthful fire. But under the surface, tension brewed. Robert's health declined sharply, culminating in a suicide attempt in February 1854, when he leapt into the icy waters of the Rhine. Though he was rescued, the incident forced his admission to an asylum in Andernach. Clara, pregnant with her 8th child, was forbidden from visiting him for months. In this dark hour, Brahms stepped into a role that was both practical and intimate, caretaker, emotional anchor, and guardian of her household. What began as companionship deepened into something neither openly acknowledged. While Robert lived, any overt display of romantic affection would have been unthinkable, and yet their letters from this period reveal an intimacy of thought that went far beyond casual friendship. Brahms' words to Clara brimmed with tenderness. "I can do nothing but think of you. It is as though you were a precious work of art that I cannot let out of my sight." Clara, in turn, confided her innermost feelings about Robert's illness, her exhaustion, her fear of the future. She addressed him as my beloved friend, a phrase that carried layers of meaning both of them understood but never spoke aloud. Music became their safe space, a realm where emotions could be expressed without violating propriety. Brahms would compose pieces and bring them to Clara for her opinion. She would sight read them, her fingers finding the voice he had poured into the score. Sometimes they played side by side for hours, speaking little, each lost in the intertwining melodies. It was during this time that Brahms composed some of his most tender piano works, pieces that Clara later said seemed to speak directly to my heart. She, in turn, found in his music a kind of solace she could not find elsewhere, a place where grief, love, and hope existed together without contradiction. Yet, for all their closeness, there was a line they would not cross. Whether out of loyalty to Robert, fear of scandal, or the knowledge that a public romance could destroy them both, they maintained a formal distance in public. Friends and acquaintances whispered, but no proof ever surfaced. To the outside world, Brahms was the devoted protégé and Clara the grieving wife, bound together by art and tragedy, nothing more. Still, there were moments, fleeting, stolen, that betrayed the depth of their connection. A glance held a second too long after a duet, a lingering hand when exchanging sheet music, and in the privacy of their letters, an undercurrent of longing that history would never entirely decode. As 1854 turned to 1855, Robert's condition showed no sign of improving. Clara was finally allowed to visit him, but his mind was already slipping away. Brahms remained her steadfast ally, managing household affairs, shielding her from financial hardship, and offering a constant stream of encouragement. Yet even as they grew closer, the unresolved question of their relationship hung between them like an unfinished chord. Would they ever allow themselves to move beyond friendship? Or was the bond they shared destined to remain in the realm of music, wordless, profound, and forever incomplete? That question would only deepen as tragedy forced them to confront their feelings in ways neither had anticipated. By the spring of 1855, Clara's visits to Robert were tinged with sorrow. Each journey to the asylum in Dunwich carried the faint hope of recognition, of a lucid conversation, of some return to the man she had married. But these hopes faded with each visit. Robert's letters, when he managed to write, were erratic, drifting between tender remembrances and incomprehensible fragments. His music, once a constant in their home, had fallen silent. During these long months, Brahms remained the steady presence she could depend upon. He helped oversee her concert arrangements, managed her correspondence when she was too weary, and ensured her children were clothed and fed. His role was practical, but also quietly intimate. In the quiet after the children had gone to bed, they would often sit together in the lamplight. She at her embroidery, he at the piano, sometimes exchanging only a few words before the night wore on. It was in such moments, the quiet in-between spaces of grief, that their attachment deepened. Brahms was acutely aware of the fragility of her position, a woman of stature and artistry, but still bound by the conventions of widowhood to come, not yet free to love openly. Clara, for her part, found in Brahms not only a friend, but someone who seemed to understand the full spectrum of her life, from the public performer to the private, often lonely mother. Their letters from this period bear witness to an intensifying closeness. Brahms' words, though never explicitly romantic, carried an undercurrent of devotion. I would gladly give up everything if only I could see you happy. Clara, in turn, wrote of how his presence lightens the heaviness of my days and brings warmth into the cold corridors of my thoughts. Their shared work on musical projects became a safe conduit for emotions they could not openly declare. Brahms brought Clara his early piano concerto in D minor, a work of stormy passion and restless energy. She advised him on certain passages, praised others, and her annotations in his manuscripts survive, delicate pencil marks that hint at evenings spent side by side over the score. It was perhaps in the music that they spoke most honestly. Clara's performances of Brahms' works were imbued with an intimacy that those in the audience could not entirely explain. Listeners heard something personal in the phrasing, a lingering on certain notes, a tenderness in quiet passages that seemed almost like a private conversation between pianist and composer. In 1856, a shift came. Brahms, aware of the increasing gossip surrounding his closeness to Clara, decided to leave Dusseldorf for a time. The decision was practical, to continue his own career, to avoid scandal, but it was also an act of self-protection. The pull toward Clara was undeniable, yet the boundaries of propriety and their own unspoken restraint held firm. Clara's diary from that year speaks of a loneliness in the midst of company after Brahms' departure. She continued her concert tours, performing across Germany, Austria, and beyond, but there was a note of weariness in her entries. The applause no longer lifted her as it once had. The absence of a certain young composer's approving gaze seemed to dull the sparkle of her triumphs. By mid-1856, Robert's condition worsened dramatically. Clara, heavily burdened by both her touring schedule and the care of her children, received word that her husband's life was drawing to a close. She rushed to his side at the asylum, accompanied by Brahms, who had returned upon hearing the news. On July 29, 1856, Robert Schumann died. Clara was present, holding his hand, with Brahms nearby. The loss, though long anticipated, struck with a force that neither of them could have fully prepared for. In that moment, Clara was both a widow and a woman standing on the threshold of a new, uncertain chapter. In the weeks following Robert's death, Brahms became Clara's most trusted support. He helped her sort through Robert's papers, organized the transfer of musical manuscripts, and shielded her from unwanted public intrusions. Yet the shadow of grief was deep, and the propriety of the time still dictated that a widow's mourning should be both visible and prolonged. Their letters from this period reveal a strange duality, moments of intense emotional connection counterbalanced by a deliberate restraint. Brahms wrote, "I wish to be near you, yet I fear to overstep." Clara responded with gratitude for his unfailing kindness, but there is an unmistakable subtext, a yearning carefully hidden beneath formal language. Society's expectations were clear. Clara was to dedicate herself to her children, her late husband's musical legacy, and her own performances. Any romantic entanglement, especially so soon after Robert's death, would risk her reputation. For Brahms, the challenge was even more complex. He was aware that to openly declare himself would not only invite scandal, but might also tarnish Clara's standing in the musical world. And so they lived in a suspended state, bound by a love they could not name, navigating a public image that allowed them to remain in each other's lives without provoking condemnation. This balancing act was not without its cost. There were moments of withdrawal, even tension, when the closeness became too much to bear without resolution. Yet each time, they found their way back to one another, through letters, through music, through a shared understanding that needed no verbal acknowledgement. It was as though their love existed in a parallel key, not the dominant melody of their public lives, but a constant harmonic underpinning, shaping every note they played and every choice they made. By the end of 1856, both Clara and Brahms stood at a crossroads. The grief was still raw, the social constraints still rigid, but the bond between them had only deepened through shared loss. Would they step beyond the invisible boundary they had so carefully observed? Or would the very intensity of their feelings keep them locked in this state of longing, forever close, forever apart? The answer would unfold in the years to come, but for now, their love remained what it had always been, a quiet, powerful undercurrent, moving beneath the surface of history's grand events. In the months after Robert's death, life began to reassemble itself around Clara. She resumed concert tours with renewed intensity, partly for financial necessity, partly to keep grief at bay. The stage became her sanctuary, the one place where she could channel emotion into sound without fear of judgment. Yet always, Brahms lingered on the edges of her life. After a brief period away, he returned to Dusseldorf and later to Hamburg and Vienna, weaving himself once again into her orbit. The public explanation for his presence was simple. A close friend of the late Robert, a composer whose career Clara publicly supported. Privately, his visits rekindled the unspoken intimacy that had been their constant since those dark days of 1854. Their correspondence became the lifeline between their physical meetings. Brahms' letters were filled with fragments of his compositions, witty observations from his travels, and coded phrases that carried a deeper resonance only Clara would understand. Her replies, often delayed by her touring schedule, blended news of her children, reviews from her concerts, and reflections on the music he had sent. One particular exchange from the late 1850s hints at the push and pull of their relationship. Brahms teased her about a rival pianist who had praised her playing, writing, He speaks of you as though you are an unattainable muse. I can't decide if I should correct him or agree entirely. Clara's reply, equally veiled, read, "Some muses, dear Johannes, remain just out of reach. It is what keeps the artist striving." As the years passed, they collaborated on numerous musical endeavors. Clara became one of the foremost interpreters of Brahms' works, championing his pieces on international stages. She premiered his piano concerto, performed his chamber works, and offered candid advice that he valued above all others. In turn, Brahms dedicated some of his most tender compositions to her, though never so directly that the world could read them as declarations of love. Music functioned as their shared language, capable of saying what they could not. In the lush second movement of Brahms' piano concerto in B-flat major, listeners heard a depth of feeling that seemed to belong to a world outside of concert halls, private, intimate, and aching with restraint. By the 1860s and 1870s, their lives had settled into a rhythm of intermittent meetings and constant correspondence. Brahms' career flourished, his symphonies and choral works earning him a place among the giants of romantic music. Clara's own renown as a pianist and teacher grew, and her interpretations of Robert's and Johann's works became benchmarks for generations to follow. Yet beneath their public triumphs, the unresolved nature of their relationship endured. They spent holidays together on occasion, visited one another's homes, and took walks in quiet gardens, always within the limits imposed by their mutual sense of propriety. There were times when the strain of this lifelong restraint became apparent. In some letters, Brahms expressed frustration at his own inability to bridge the gap between friendship and romance. Clara, for her part, occasionally withdrew when she sensed public suspicion or when the emotional closeness threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. But neither ever severed the bond entirely. Even in their most distant periods, Brahms would send scores for her review, and Clara would reply with honest, sometimes sharply critical, but always caring assessments. As the 19th century drew toward its end, age began to slow them both. Clara's hands, once capable of commanding the most demanding passages, grew stiff from decades of performance. Brahms, too, felt the weight of years, though he continued to compose prolifically. In their later meetings, there was less urgency, but perhaps more openness in their shared silences. Sitting side by side, they could speak without words, their long history woven into every pause, every glance. The passion of youth had given way to a profound mutual respect, and a love that was no less deep for having never been fully realized. In 1896, Clara's health declined sharply after a stroke. Brahms visited her in Frankfurt, where she lay bedridden, her speech slurred but her eyes still bright when he entered the room. They spent hours together, speaking softly when they could, and simply sitting in silence when words failed. Clara died on May 20th, 1896. Brahms, devastated, attended her funeral. Friends noted that he seemed more frail than ever, as though her passing had taken some essential part of him. Less than a year later, on April 3rd, 1897, Johannes Brahms himself passed away, the two of them now joined only in memory. The world would remember Clara Schumann as one of the greatest pianists of her era, and Johannes Brahms as a towering composer. Yet between their public legacies lies a quieter truth. Their lives were shaped by a bond that never needed formal acknowledgement to be real. In their music, they spoke to each other and to us, across decades of longing, respect, and unfulfilled desire. Every delicate turn of phrase in Clara's interpretations, every aching melody in Brahms' works, carries the imprint of a love that lived outside the boundaries of convention. What does their story teach us? That love is not always measured by possession, nor is its value diminished by restraint. For Clara and Johannes, love was a lifelong act of presence, of showing up again and again, even when the world could not know the full truth. And so, though history may record their relationship as friendship, their music tells a different story, one of two souls who found in each other a lifelong harmony, even if they could never play the final resolving chord. And so, in the end, their story was neither scandal nor simple friendship. It was a quiet defiance against the limits of their time. A love carried in letters, sustained across decades, and revealed only when the world was finally ready to see it. What do you think? Was theirs a romance in the truest sense, or something even deeper? Let's talk about it in the comments.